A black man in Ohio sentenced to more than 330 years behind bars is now hoping that a new DNA testing will exonerate him. Samuel Herring has already spent nearly 4 decades in prison for a crime that he says he did not commit. In 1984, Phyllis CLE was left blinded after she was kidnapped, raped, and stabbed. Herring was convicted, and CLE fought against him being released until she died in 2013. And now, officials in Summit County are taking a new look at the case at the request of the Ohio Innocence Project. The story is drawing national attention, including extensive reporting from the Marshall Project. Joining me now is Mark Pente. He is a reporter for the Marshall Project, Cleveland. He is helping shed light on the case, as is the entire organization. Mark, I want to thank you for joining me on the show. It's so good to see you again. It's been a while. We know what happened to CLE, the woman who was raped in this case. The question is, what role did Herring play? Why do investigators think that he's the one who did it?
Thanks, Mark, for having me. Well, back in 1984, when Miss CLE was attacked, she recalled seeing a house with a certain blue gable and an eagle on it. Police found it and realized that the vacant home was an after-hours party house that was owned by the Herring family. Police focused on Samuel Herring because he had served some time for shooting a man and a burglary case. Herring willingly cooperated with officers, went down to the police department, said he had nothing to hide, said where he was at, but he was charged and convicted within 3 months under a program called the Career Fast Track Program for individuals with prior records. And he's been sitting in prison for 40 years, and he's fighting now to clear his name through his DNA evidence.
Wow. The question people always have, I always have, is why can't they just use DNA testing to exonerate him earlier, right? I mean, like, you got DNA tests, you have his DNA. If he's making the case that there's something exculpatory here about DNA evidence, then, like, why not just use it?
Well, that's the big question in this case. When the attack occurred, Ms. CLE said that the perpetrator threw Pine Sol, a cleaner, all over her and her garments. At the time, technology wouldn't allow and forensic technologists for the state to extract the DNA evidence, so they couldn't use that to say that Herring was there. There was some cross-racial eyewitness account that would be considered junk science by today's standards. So there was really no direct DNA evidence tying Herring to the crime. But now that their technology has evolved, garments and other evidence is now being tested. We know that some testing has come back, and there's more further testing on that going now.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I remember distinctly when this happened, how fervent Ms. CLE was about him remaining in prison forever.
The CLE family...
She was convinced... Yeah, please continue. Go ahead. That's just what I was going to ask you about the family now that she's passed. Sort of, they've seemed to have taken up the torch of saying, no, he stays in prison. And also, in light of this new testing, I want to know how they're reacting.
Sure. Phyllis CLE became a well-known victims advocate, rightfully so, after the attack. She became well-known speaking victims' rights. But after her passing, her family has carried the torch for the family, saying that Herring needs to stay behind bars. My colleague Tara Morgan from News 5, who co-reported this story with myself, we called about 20 of Phyllis CLE's relatives. They called the prosecutor's office and asked the prosecutor to say no comment. They don't want to speak. So we're waiting to see what they will say if this testing does come back, where it does free Samuel Herring.
It's a fascinating thing, as a victim's advocate. Obviously you want to make sure that they have rights, but you also want to follow due process. And so it will be interesting, to sort of get a sense of how they respond if he is exonerated, because to me, it doesn't hurt the case for victims' rights. Victims should have rights, but it doesn't mean that everyone is guilty who's in prison. And watching those two things play out is going to be very interesting. You wrote a piece that I also thought was interesting. You said something that I thought was really striking. You say black people represented over half the 3,200 exonerations through September 2022. Innocent black people are almost 8 times more likely than white people to be falsely convicted of rape. Help us understand why that would be the case.
Well, based on some of the standards that put Mr. Herring in prison, the junk science and misidentification, unfortunately, shoddy detective work, shoddy police work, that's well known in a lot of these exoneration cases. hysteria that's created in some of these communities where the crimes occur. You add all that up, and I'm not an expert on exonerations, but the facts speak for themselves. Facts matter. And two groups that track this nationally have documented the disparity on how African Americans represent more than half these cases, which is troubling. Which goes to show why more testing should be done in these cases. If there's evidence available to test, to know for certainty that the perpetrator is behind bars and it's the right individual.
There's so many things here, right, that you just said. But one thing that I'm struggling with is understanding is, to what extent is shoddy detective work just being bad at being detectives? How much of it is we have malice, we want to actually just lock up the wrong person? And how much of it is we think we know who did it, so we're going to cut some corners and, use junk science or have an unreliable witness, not because we think we're railroading somebody, but because we know the guy did it and we're not going to let them get away on a technicality, that kind of thinking. How do those things, which one of those things is the dominant sort of push to get people wrongfully convicted in your estimation?
Yeah, I can't speak to that with authority, but just on this case alone, that, there was a similar crime that day in Akron that they weren't connected. It created hysteria in the community. It created a fear. Police said they would deliver a suspect. They did. Herring willingly went down there multiple times. He said he had nothing to hide. He was going to a boxing, preparing for a boxing match. You add all that stuff up, and it put him in jail 3 months. It would never happen today. If a person is charged with those crimes, they would never be convicted by a jury within 3 months. It takes years. It just raises questions on how a lot of these convictions dating decades are playing out, and people are sitting behind bars for cases where they didn't happen. Now, Mr. Herring contacted the Ohio Innocence Project after going to the pro board saying, hey, I'm not going to take ownership of it. I didn't do it. A board member told him, contact Innocence Project. Mr. Herring at the time, in years past, didn't really know about that organization, so he wrote a letter, laid out who he thought was a suspect,
Wow.
and we didn't report on all those details yet because we're not sure of that, but there's more to the story. And if it does come out, I think it takes it to the next level.
I hope it does, man. I want justice no matter what that looks like. So hopefully if there's more information that will give us a clearer picture, we'll get that information as soon as possible. But I thank you for the reporting you and your partners have already done at the paper and in this particular story. Mark Pente is a reporter for the Marshall Project, Cleveland. Thanks again, my brother.